all heard the stories of collapsing empires, barbarian invasions, and the end of an era. But as we're going to see, the true story is actually a complete masterclass in survival.
Let's kick things off with a classic historical question. When did the Roman Empire actually fall? If you open up a standard history textbook or just ask someone on the street, you're almost guaranteed to get the exact same answer. They'll tell you the whole thing crashed and burned in 476 AD. It's just one of those dates that's been drilled into our collective consciousness, right?
Well, actually, that answer is pretty incredibly misleading because the Roman Empire definitely didn't just vanish in the 5th century. Instead, the empire anchored itself to the ultimate adapt or die strategy and managed to survive for nearly another entire millennium. And to really understand how they pulled off one of history's greatest vanishing acts, surviving by basically moving right under their enemies' noses, we kind of need to rewind a bit. Okay, so the story starts with the founding of Rome as this tiny city-state way back in 753 BC. And from there, it just expanded relentlessly. By 107 AD, under Emperor Trajan, Rome hit its absolute peak. We are talking about a massive superpower spanning a staggering 2 million square miles. And remember, this was all managed without a single text message or email. It stretched from Britannia in the west all the way to Syria in the east. But by the time the 3rd century rolled around, some really massive cracks were starting to form in the foundation. 50 million. That number right there was the root of the problem. That's 50 million subjects. To put that into perspective, that is roughly the population of modern-day South Korea or Spain, scattered across dozens of different cultures. It made the empire virtually impossible to govern without modern communication. I mean, you've got multiple frontiers to guard and just an unimaginable scale of territory to try and control. And that brings us to a period of just cascading failures. The Praetorian Guard was literally assassinating emperors and selling the throne to the highest bidder. At one point, 4 different men claimed the throne in a single year. Talk about zero job security. Now, combine that insane turnover with economic hyperinflation, terrifying plagues like smallpox wiping out huge chunks of the population and the army, and then add in unrelenting pressure from Germanic and Persian invasions, the old ways of expanding and ruling by force, they were failing fast. The Roman Empire was quite literally tearing itself apart. But then, Emperor Constantine looks at this absolute mess, and he executes a stroke of strategic genius. Rather than going down with the sinking ship in the city of Rome, he just relocates the capital. In 330 AD, he builds a brand new center of power in the east, Constantinople. He realizes the future isn't in a vulnerable, bloated Italy. No, it's on a massive, highly defensible choke point right between Europe and Asia. The contrast here is really stark. On one side, you have the old Western half. It's Latin-speaking, tied to ancient pagan traditions, stretched dangerously thin and actively being targeted by barbarian tribes. But on the other side, the New East, anchored by Constantinople. It's Greek-speaking, economically wealthy, and heavily fortified. And uniquely, it was built from the ground up as a Christian city. Naturally, all the intellectuals, the wealth, and the administration just started packing up and migrating east. This growing divide became totally permanent in 395 AD. When Emperor Theodosius died, the empire was officially split right down the middle between his 2 young sons. One took the east, ruling from Constantinople, and the other took the west. The absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that the 2 administrations essentially just stopped working together. So the rich, secure east thrived while the west was left isolated. It became this highly vulnerable, fading province. Now, the west didn't just collapse overnight. It was a devastating domino effect. It started when the fearsome Huns literally exploded out of the Eurasian steppe, which forced tens of thousands of Goths to seek asylum across the Roman border. The Romans do let them in, but then corrupt officials exploit and starve these refugees so badly that they revolt, and they ultimately destroy a Roman army at Adrianople. Desperate, the West starts making these frantic land deals with armed groups just to stop the fighting. But the fatal blow, that comes when the Vandals seize North Africa, which completely cuts off the Western Roman Empire from its most vital source of grain and tax revenue. So without money and without a functioning army, the final humiliating blows fall on the city of Rome itself, and they happen in really quick succession. First, the Visigoths sack Rome in 410 AD, then the Vandals sack it again in 455. Finally, in 476 AD, a Germanic commander politely tells the very last Western emperor to just step down. And in this twist of incredible historical irony, that final emperor was a kid named Romulus Augustulus. He literally carried the name of Rome's mythical founder, Romulus, and its first emperor, Augustus. And just like that, the West was gone. But hey, let's shift our gaze eastward for a second.
Because while the West burned, the Eastern Roman Empire, which modern historians later decided to call the Byzantine Empire, it just kept going. And by the way, they didn't see themselves as Byzantines. To them, they were Romans. They were operating the legitimate Roman state, just, with a new, brilliantly positioned capital.
1,000. That is exactly how many extra years the Eastern Roman Empire endured after the fall of the West. It is honestly mind-blowing when you think about it. The empire that birthed Julius Caesar and Augustus didn't die in 476. Half of it adapted, fortified its borders, and managed to survive for an entire extra millennium. And they definitely didn't just sit around peacefully during that time either. They fought like crazy to survive. They repelled massive invasions from the Persians to their east, they held off rapidly expanding Arab empires to the south, and ironically enough, they were severely weakened by crusaders coming from the west. Surviving this endless onslaught century after century, that required incredible diplomatic flexibility, unmatched defensive walls around Constantinople, and an administration that absolutely refused to quit. But, of course, all things eventually come to an end. In the year 1453, the mighty walls of Constantinople were finally breached under the cannons of the Ottoman Empire. The city transitioned from a Christian capital to a Muslim one, and that really brought a close to the Roman story. As one of our historical sources so perfectly puts it, the last state that still called itself Roman fell.
So, I really want to leave you with this thought to chew on. Did Rome actually fall in 476, or did it just adapt to survive? History is rarely as clean-cut as a single date in a textbook. The Roman Empire realized it was too big, it was too vulnerable, and it was way too fractured. So it shifted its center of gravity. It sacrificed its crumbling western half to guarantee the survival of its wealthy, fortified eastern half for another 1,000 years. It's a pretty profound reminder for businesses, nations, and honestly, even us as individuals. True power doesn't always lie in endless expansion, but in knowing exactly when to adapt.
The Roman Empire built pristine aqueducts, developed complex legal codes, and constructed paved roads that spanned continents. Yet at the absolute center of this sophisticated civilization lay an institution that was dedicated entirely to state-sponsored slaughter. The Colosseum functioned as a highly calibrated political instrument. It was a physical barometer that perfectly mirrored the stability and the eventual decay of the Roman state. For centuries, the Roman Republic survived by pushing its aggression outward. Conquering neighboring tribes kept the military busy and the treasury full. That outward expansion held the state together, right up until Julius Caesar turned his conquering legions inward and dismantled the Republic's democratic norms. His successor, Augustus, took a different approach. He halted the endless expansion. By turning the military into a permanent, professional standing army, he effectively froze Rome's borders in place. This newfound peace created an immediate vulnerability. The capital city of Rome was suddenly packed with a massive, heavily armed, and under-occupied urban population with nowhere to direct their energy. The state engineered a system to consume that violent energy within the city walls. They turned the public consumption of death into a primary requirement for social order. By 80 AD, Emperor Titus understood this dynamic perfectly. He opened the Colosseum with 100 continuous days of games, a calculated maneuver to purchase the loyalty of the Roman mob. This was the literal execution of bread and circuses. It was a strict, unwritten contract. The emperor provided free grain to keep the population fed and extravagant blood sport to keep them entertained. In exchange, the public offered absolute obedience. To deliver that entertainment, Roman builders constructed the hypogeum. Beneath the arena floor lay a massive labyrinth of capstans, pulleys, and trapdoors. This machinery allowed thousands of men, animals, and entire stage sets to appear on the sands as if by magic. The morning shows featured the slaughter of exotic animals, lions, bears, and leopards shipped from the edges of the known world. Watching these beasts die was visual proof to the citizens that Rome held absolute dominion over nature itself. Then came the gladiators. These fighters were enslaved, yet embodied the martial discipline and courage Romans valued. When beaten, a fighter could raise a single finger to submit. The fight stopped immediately, and the power of life or death transferred to the emperor. The arena operated as a perfectly tuned instrument of psychological control. In front of 50,000 cheering citizens, the emperor performed the role of a living god, orchestrating order out of chaos. That system of total control held until the late 2nd century. Under the rule of Marcus Aurelius, the illusion of Roman invincibility began to shatter. The very legions tasked with securing those frontiers returned home carrying the Antonine Plague, likely a devastating strain of smallpox. The Roman administrative machine relied on predictable tax revenue and a massive, healthy labor force. When the plague killed millions, it decimated the farmers who grew the grain and the soldiers who guarded the borders, leaving the treasury empty and the frontiers exposed. With the workforce dying, tax collectors returned empty-handed, and the state's ability to maintain its vast infrastructure began to fail. Rome discovered that its legions were entirely useless against an invisible threat they could not see. The rot quickly reached the highest level of leadership. Marcus Aurelius was succeeded by his son, Commodus, a man who bankrupted the national treasury to pay for lavish games, where he starred as the headline gladiator. By stepping onto the bloody sands, Commodus broke the social contract. Gladiators were legally classified at the absolute bottom of Roman society. When the emperor abandoned his seat of control to perform alongside them, he alienated the Senate and degraded the office. Imperial authority entered a death spiral. The Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit supposed to protect the emperor, realized they held the real power. They began assassinating rulers, and in one instance, literally auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. When national leadership devolves into pure theatrical vanity and military extortion, the institutional legitimacy required to run an empire evaporates. Meanwhile, a new movement was redefining what it meant to die in the arena. When early Christians like Ignatius of Antioch were condemned to the beasts, they didn't plead for mercy. They faced death with a sense of joy that the crowds had never seen before. The arena's function inverted. Instead of projecting imperial dominance, these public executions became highly visible marketing events for a faith that promised obedience to a higher authority than the emperor. The physical state was breaking just as fast. The empire was cleaved in two to manage its sprawling size. Soon after, massive waves of Gothic refugees, fleeing the Huns, overwhelmed the northern borders, which shattered Rome's defensive lines. The final blow to Rome's oldest mechanism of distraction came when a Christian monk named Telemachus stepped into the Colosseum to stop a gladiatorial bout. The outraged mob stoned him to death, prompting the emperor to permanently ban the games. Today, the Colosseum stands as a hollowed-out tomb. It remains a permanent historical warning. A civilization that attempts to mask systemic rot and geopolitical collapse with violent political theater will eventually fall.
Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when most of us picture the fall of the Roman Empire, our minds immediately jump to these sweeping apocalyptic visuals, right? Flaming arrows raining down, city gates crashing open, massive barbarian hordes storming the capital. But the historical reality, it's actually far more insidious than that. Long before any foreign invaders ever breached the walls, Rome was already suffering from a severe, systematic internal disease. So today, we're taking a really close look at the anatomy of that rot. We're going to examine the deep moral and institutional decay that systematically hollowed out the empire from the inside, ultimately leaving behind this fragile shell that was just destined to crumble.
So, let's dive right in. How on earth does a civilization that literally conquered the known world end up dismantling itself through sheer absurdity and corruption? I mean, this doesn't just happen overnight. To really grasp this downfall, we're going to trace two distinct yet deeply connected threads of this civilizational disease. First, the absolute madness and moral decay of the emperors at the very top. And second, the shocking betrayal by the exact institutions that were designed to protect them. It's a fascinating and honestly a deeply cautionary story about what happens when a society starts valuing spectacle way more than substance and raw violence over the rule of law.
To get to the bottom of this collapse, we first have to understand exactly how the Roman elite viewed the arena, because this perfectly sets the stage for the most scandalous emperor in history. This quote is absolutely vital context. In ancient Rome, gladiators were undeniably popular entertainers, right? Kind of like our modern-day rock stars. But legally and socially, it was a totally different story. They were categorized under a concept called infamia. This meant they were legally stripped of their rights. They couldn't vote, they couldn't testify in court, and they were officially placed in the exact same social bucket as pimps and prostitutes. They were seen as people who sold their physical bodies for the fleeting pleasure of the mob. Keep that incredibly strict social hierarchy in mind, because the man at the very top of the empire is about to completely shatter it.
Section 1. The Moral Rot. Commodus in the Colosseum.
This brings us to a massive generational whiplash that Rome experienced. The contrast between these two men is just staggering. On one side, we have Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Historically, he's revered as the ultimate philosopher king. This was a guy who literally ran the entire Roman Empire from freezing military tents on the frontier, fighting off devastating plagues, all while writing Meditations, which remains one of the most profound philosophical texts in human history. And then, he passes the empire to a son, Commodus. Instead of leading armies or managing this incredibly complex global state, Commodus decides his true calling is the roar of the crowd. He literally wanted to strip down, cover himself in oil, and be the headline bout in the Colosseum. Now, to grasp why this was so incredibly destructive, think about the ruling class he was supposed to be leading. The Roman Senate wasn't just a room full of local politicians. These senatorial families were ancient, highly educated, and possessed wealth equivalent to modern multinational agricultural corporations. Their entire worldview was built on this concept of dignity and gravitas, so watching their emperor willingly step into the arena, that wasn't just a quirky hobby or a mild embarrassment, it was a horrifying willing debasement of the most powerful office on the planet. Commodus was taking the majesty of Rome and deliberately dragging it down into the blood and dirt, completely alienating the very people he needed to actually run the government. And get this, he didn't even do it for free. 1 million sesterces. That was the scandalous fee Commodus charged the bankrupt Roman treasury for every single appearance he made in the arena. To put that into perspective for us today, that is nearly $10 million. Per fight. The Roman treasury was already severely strained, but Commodus essentially invented the world's most extortionate appearance fee, bleeding the state dry just to feed his own unchecked narcissism. He was basically using the games as this incredibly crude, insanely expensive contract to buy the love of the common people, all while financially devastating the exact empire he was meant to protect. As you might guess, this narcissism quickly escalated from financial extortion into blatant, unhinged political threats. It just wasn't enough for Commodus to fight in the Colosseum. He actually tried to erase Rome's historical identity entirely, officially renaming the Eternal City Colonia Commodiana, literally Commodus's colony. And to make absolutely sure the Senate understood who was in charge, he commissioned a massive statue of himself dressed as the god Hercules, holding a drawn bow. He deliberately had a position so that the arrow was pointing directly at the front doors of the Senate House. Imagine showing up to legislate and there's a giant statue of your unhinged ruler threatening to shoot you. It was a visceral, physical act of pure intimidation. Well, eventually the extortion, the madness, and the direct threats pushed the ruling class way past their breaking point. The Senate knew they had to act to save whatever fragments of Roman dignity were left. And this wasn't just some random murder. It was a desperate, highly calculated political purge. The Senate orchestrated his assassination. And in a moment of sheer poetic irony, the man who delivered the final fatal blow was none other than Narcissus, Commodus's own personal gladiatorial trainer. He was strangled in his bath by the exact same man who taught him how to fight. The gladiatorial obsession that totally defined his reign was exactly what ended it.
Section 2. The Institutional Rot. Rise of the Praetorians.
Okay, let's pivot to the second major symptom of Rome's collapse, because it perfectly highlights how supposed protectors can morph into the ultimate predators. The Praetorian Guard was originally established by Rome's first emperor, Augustus. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of the Secret Service, a highly elite, fiercely loyal military unit dedicated solely to protecting the emperor and maintaining stability in the capital. But stationing thousands of heavily armed elite troops right next to the seat of political power had a very dark side effect. Over the generations, the Guard realized a simple, brutal truth. Whoever controls the sword standing closest to the emperor essentially controls the entire empire. This whole mutation of power really kicked off with Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was highly introverted, grew to absolutely despise the politics of Rome, and completely abandoned the capital to live in isolation on the island of Capri. By physically leaving, he created a massive power vacuum back home. Think of it in modern terms. If the CEO of a massive global company just disappears to a remote island, the executive assistant who controls their inbox and their calendar basically becomes the de facto CEO, right? That is exactly what the commander of the Praetorian Guard did. They filtered the intelligence reaching Tiberius, they controlled exactly who was allowed to physically see him, and seamlessly began manipulating the levers of government entirely from the shadows. As time went on, the Guard just grew bolder, transforming from bodyguards to manipulators, and finally to outright executioners. Augustus created them. Under Tiberius, they tasted real political power. But the true turning point came with Emperor Caligula. When Caligula's erratic behavior finally crossed the line, the Praetorians didn't politely ask him to step down. They didn't consult the Senate. They literally cornered him in a hallway and executed him. And immediately, on the spot, they found Caligula's terrified uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain, dragged him to their camp, and declared him the new emperor of the known world. The Senate had zero say in the matter.
So the crucial takeaway here is this: military force had completely and utterly devoured political legitimacy. This set a terrifying precedent that permanently scarred the empire. The intricate system of Roman law, the ancient traditions of the Senate, the voice of the citizens, none of it held any weight anymore. It was mafia-style extortion on an imperial scale. If you paid massive bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, you got to be emperor. The exact moment the money ran out, or the moment they found someone willing to pay more, you were dead. It was a government held entirely hostage by its own security detail.
Section 3. The ultimate betrayal. Auctioning the empire.
This long decay culminates in an event so brazen, so darkly comedic, that it honestly sounds like historical fiction. The year is 193 AD. The Praetorian Guard has just assassinated another emperor, and they realize they are in possession of the ultimate priceless commodity. Instead of quietly picking a favorite general or politician to take the throne, they literally stood on the fortified walls of their military camp and shouted out to the wealthiest men in Rome. They held a literal cash auction for the Roman Empire. The greatest superpower on earth, stretching from the misty hills of Britain all the way to the deserts of Syria, was sold off like a piece of used furniture to a remarkably wealthy man named Didius Julianus.
66 days. That is exactly how long Emperor Julianus survived after handing over a fortune to buy the entire Roman world. Because here is the brutal, inescapable reality of a society built entirely on bribery and mercenary loyalty. The moment you buy power, someone else with a larger army will simply march in and take it from you. The provincial legions out in the empire realized the Praetorians had just sold the throne, so they marched on Rome, executed Julianus right there in the palace, and took the throne by force. Loyalty that is bought is incredibly, dangerously cheap. The very foundation of the state had dissolved into pure violence.
So let's pull all these threads together to really see a civilization in terminal decline. On one side, you had leaders like Commodus. He completely destroyed the moral authority of the government by treating the throne like a theatrical performance, prioritizing his personal brand and violent spectacle way over actual governance. On the other side, you had the Praetorian Guard, who destroyed the physical security of the state by abandoning their duty to act as violent, greedy mercenaries. Tradition, public consensus, the rule of law, it was all completely suffocated by whoever had the biggest treasury and the sharpest swords. Rome wasn't just suffering a string of bad luck, it was systematically poisoned by its own internal mechanisms.
I want to leave you with that provocative thought to really ponder. What we learn from the anatomy of Rome's rot is that massive walls, sprawling armies, and endless wealth absolutely cannot protect a state that has already died on the inside. True collapse begins when institutions fail and leaders become mere spectacles.
We spend so much time talking about the mighty Roman Empire, right? Its conquests, the gladiators, that sprawling architecture. But today we're looking at a completely different kind of battle. We're going to unpack this astonishing story of how a microscopic pathogen literally brought the Roman Empire to its knees, right at the absolute peak of its power. So we're going to track the timeline, the staggering medical crisis, and the frantic response of antiquity's most brilliant doctor.
So how do you defeat an invincible empire? It's kind of a fascinating thought experiment. I mean, at its height, Rome's borders stretched across 2 million square miles. They had subdued the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Egyptians, controlled a huge chunk of Western Europe. So who could possibly take them down? Well, the answer, as it turns out, wasn't a rival army. It wasn't some brilliant enemy general. It was an enemy that Rome couldn't even see. We're talking about an invader that crossed borders without a single weapon, completely bypassing those massive stone walls and the highly trained legions stationed along the frontiers.
Just picture the Roman legion for a second. You've got roughly 150,000 professional, full-time soldiers, backed up by an equal number of auxiliaries. They've got heavy armor, standardized weapons, iron discipline, and a tactical playbook that literally conquered the known world. But they were up against an invisible enemy. A microscopic pathogen. It obviously has no armor, but it's extremely contagious, and, perhaps most crucially here, it is hitting a population with absolute zero immunity. It's essentially the ultimate David and Goliath story. But in this case, David is a virus, and Goliath's impenetrable armor is, well, completely useless.
Okay, let's set the stage.
In 162 AD, Rome is enjoying its absolute golden age. It is the cultural center of the universe, wealthy, stable, and leading the world in philosophy and medicine under the rule of the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius and his co-emperor Lucius Verus. But fast forward just a few years to 168 AD, and bam, we hit the Winter of Plague. In this incredibly short window, the empire shifted from an absolute peak of prosperity straight into a devastating, crippling winter of disease. The crazy part? The very roads and trade routes that made Rome so rich and powerful suddenly became superhighways for this lethal pathogen.
To really grasp the sheer panic of that winter, we have to look at what this disease actually did to the human body. And honestly, the symptoms were a total nightmare. Victims suffered from extreme diarrhea, severe vomiting, and scorching fevers. But what was truly terrifying was what happened to the skin. Black scabs and horrifying lesions would form and then literally just fall off. Historians and modern epidemiologists looking at these accounts today actually believe this was likely a lethal form of hemorrhagic smallpox, a strain that causes horrific bleeding right under the skin. Just imagine the terror of seeing this tear through your family, your community, at a time when nobody even knows what a virus is. The absolutely crucial point here is that this wasn't just, a bad flu season. This was a health crisis of the highest order. Disease actually became an existential threat to Rome itself. Because the population had zero previous exposure to this specific pathogen, there were no natural defenses. None. It spread like wildfire, killing a massive percentage of anyone infected. And crucially, it began devastating the invincible Roman army. The legions packed so tightly in those military camps, they were absolute sitting ducks. I mean, you can't defend the borders of a 2 million square mile empire if your soldiers are too weak to lift their shields, or worse, dying in their barracks.
So, with the empire quite literally coughing itself to death, leadership had to act. Enter Galen of Pergamon. He was antiquity's most ambitious and probably brilliant medical scientist. But Galen wasn't just book smart. He was a deeply fascinating, complex guy. He had a massive ego. He actively wanted to go down in history as the greatest doctor in the world. He'd actually previously worked as a surgeon keeping gladiators alive in the Colosseum, which gave him this unparalleled knowledge of human anatomy. So, for a super ambitious guy like Galen, this terrifying plague wasn't just a tragedy, it was the ultimate stage to prove his genius to the whole world.
The chain of events here was rapid. First, the outbreak severely threatens the army. In response, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who is essentially the CEO of the Western world at this point, personally summons Galen, deploying him straight to the grim, highly dangerous front lines at Aquileia. It's honestly a lot like a modern-day outbreak movie, right? The top political leader pulls the world's top infectious disease specialist and sends him straight to a military encampment to figure out how to stop this invisible invader before it wipes out the entire military.
But when Galen actually arrived, the reality on the ground broke even his massive confidence. He later wrote that the whole population struggled to survive that winter of plague. Now, coming from a guy with an ego the size of the Colosseum, that is profound. This was a man who rarely, if ever, expressed self-doubt, yet here he's revealing a really deep sense of despair. The situation at Aquileia in 168 AD was far worse than anything he could have imagined. He paints this super grim picture of being an overburdened, completely exhausted frontline healthcare worker, desperately trying to treat hundreds of dying victims in a freezing military camp, entirely surrounded by death. Let's zoom back out to the macro-level political impact for a second, because the virus didn't just target the common soldiers. For the first time in Roman history, you had two emperors ruling side by side. Marcus Aurelius, the intellectual philosopher king, and Lucius Verus, his co-emperor. But microscopic pathogens don't care if you wear a crown or live in a palace. The plague struck the absolute highest levels of Roman leadership. Lucius Verus caught the disease and died just 50 miles away from the camp at Aquileia. The illusion of imperial invincibility was completely shattered.
Which brings us to the real dramatic climax of this crisis. Marcus Aurelius is left completely alone. Just think about the crushing weight on his shoulders in this moment. His co-emperor is dead. The army, the literal backbone of Roman power, is heavily decimated by disease. And to make matters worse, barbarian enemies sense this weakness and are actively pressing at the borders. The philosopher king is now completely isolated. He's forced to preside over a destabilized, terrified, and totally fractured Roman world. It is the ultimate test of his Stoic philosophy.
But from all this incredible tragedy, something fascinating emerged, perfectly represented by a single fraction, 1/8.
While Marcus Aurelius fought to keep the empire alive, Galen was furiously documenting everything he saw. He wrote constantly. In fact, he is the most prolific author from antiquity. Today, Galen's surviving medical texts make up a staggering 1/8 of all surviving ancient Greek manuscripts. His tireless work during and after this plague resulted in this massive, completely unparalleled collection of medical data.
And the sheer impact of those frantic writings, that really comes down to the number 15. The medical knowledge Galen captured, organized, and wrote down during his lifetime went on to completely define both Islamic and European medicine for an astonishing 15 centuries. Think about that for a second. For 1,500 years, if a doctor was treating you, they were relying on the foundational texts written by the very man who battled the Antonine Plague on the front lines in ancient Rome. It's a breathtaking legacy, honestly, of human resilience and scientific documentation.
So it leaves us with a pretty sobering question. If antiquity's greatest empire couldn't fight an invisible enemy, how prepared are we today? I mean, Rome had the wealth, the infrastructure, and the most disciplined military the world had ever seen, yet a microscopic virus nearly caused the whole system to completely collapse. It really highlights the timeless fragility of even the greatest human civilizations. The story of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, and Galen reminds us that sometimes our most dangerous enemies aren't the ones carrying swords at the borders. They're the invisible ones already inside the